Today is all about tone talk, one of our favorite topics as guitar players. So I am going to let you hear a short clip of music here in a second, but what I want to go into today is kind of show you my interpretation of just a raw classic heavy metal guitar tone. So we're going to dig right into that. Here's a short clip of what you're going to learn, and I'm going to show you exactly how I got this sound that you're about to hear. Now, I know what you're already thinking. Jason, dude, do not put your beer on your guitar amp. I thought we covered this in the last video when you put your coffee mug on the amp. Don't do that. Seriously, you shouldn't do that. All right, let's dig into Jason's classic heavy metal guitar tone here. So first things first, let's just point out the obvious. First of all, I'm not using any classic gear per se, okay? I'm not using an old Marshall JCM 800 amp or a vintage guitar or really vintage anything. I'm not using any of that stuff, but I still feel like I'm able to get this tone through the settings that I'm using and through the specific channel of the amp, which you can see what amp it is, but I'm going to get into all that shortly here. But what I want to tell you is that you can use these settings on almost any amp, not any amp, but almost any amp to get this type of tone. We're not chasing an exact tone. You know, a lot of people want absolution, and I don't really believe that exists. Even if you're using the same amp as somebody used 40 years ago, you're still going to get different variations of that depending on who's playing and other factors. Okay, so I just want to kind of clear the air on the well, that's not the exact tone for that style of music. I'm going to show you how to get close to it, all right? So let's dig into the amp first. So this is the EVH 5150 amp. It's the 50 watt head and it's the EL34 tube version. I've got the matching 212 cab. I kind of would like to hook this thing up to a Marshall cab, like a Marshall 212 or even a Marshall 412 cab. I may try that. I've thought of just matching this up with some other cabs as well, just to get some tones. Kind of getting off track here, but I'm starting to get that gear junkie feeling. I need more cabs. Real quick before we get into settings, I am miking this up with a vintage old school method here, the good old Shure SM57, which, you know, that mic is used in so many styles of music. It's just a really solid mic. And to be honest with you, I haven't had a whole lot of experience using other mics. I like to be transparent with you guys. I can't really compare it to much anything else, but I love the tones I get when I'm recording with this mic, so well, that's what I use for this video and most of the videos that you guys have heard up to this point. All right, so first of all, I'm using the blue channel of the EVH amp. This is probably one of the most important factors about this tone that I'm sharing with you guys. I want to go over this because I want you to translate it to whatever amp that you're using, okay, or whatever plugin. You can use these settings on a plugin as well, or any plugin, okay? So the blue channel, this amp has 3 channels, right? A lot of amps will have like a clean channel and a dirty channel. Well, this one actually has 3. It's got a clean, it's got a dirty channel, and it's got a super high gain channel. I'm not using the super high gain channel on this amp, which is an extremely awesome, awesome tone, by the way, which you guys have heard a lot of that on my videos. That's the one I use most of the time. But this blue channel here, and I'm not necessarily featuring this amp, but this blue channel has a lower gain stage. I hope that's the appropriate way to say that, but it doesn't have that extreme high gain. It's got more of that classic, style and sound that you would get from a vintage amp or like a Marshall JCM, something like that. So if you're playing through an amp that has a clean kind of a dirty channel or a super high gain channel, what I recommend when you're going for this classic heavy metal tone is try that one in the middle. Try that if you have that option. Now, if you're playing through an amp that is a high gain amp, maybe you've got a clean channel, but your main distortion channel, it is extreme high gain. A lot of amps are made like that now. Where you're going to get that classic heavy metal tone is probably going to be in your gain setting, and that's something you're going to have to cut down quite a bit to get near that classic heavy metal tone, because you got to remember the amps way back when, they didn't have the extreme gain options that a lot of the amps have these days. And I don't know that people back then really used a whole lot of pedals. If you go back like to the Black Sabbath days, I really don't know. I'd have to check on that. You guys can tell me in the comments. Feel free to throw that in. You know, people use like fuzz pedals and stuff like that, but I didn't use any type of overdrive pedal for this amp, by the way. So going back to the amps, if you've got an amp that has the 3 channels and you got that channel this kind of in the middle for that dirty sound, use that one instead of the super high gain channel that you have. Or if you've got the high gain amp, you're going to have to remember to back the gain down quite a bit. All right, so let's take a closer look at the settings here. So you'll see my gain for this channel is up there quite a bit. However, it's not cranked all the way up. I've got this thing probably at around 7-ish here. Now remember, let me just go back real quick to what we just discussed in regards to gain. This is not a super high gain channel, this blue channel here. That would be the red channel on this amp. So if you have that channel that's kind of middle of the road like this is a good setting for your gain for your rhythm guitars for the classic heavy metal tone. Again, if you're using a fire breathing gain channel or just a super high gain amp, and that's just what it's made for, the modern metal, the modern styles or heavier styles of metal, then you're gonna want to back that gain down, and I would say play around with between like 3 and 4 on your gain there to get more of that gritty hard rock sound that's kind of breaking up a little bit instead of that full-on fire-breathing gain. So that's the caveat when it comes to amps. Same with amp sims. If you're using an amp sim, well, with amp sims, you've got an array of different types of amps. For example, when I'm using amp sims, I usually go to the Positive Grid Bias product. Okay, I've got the Bias Amp 2 and FX2. When I'm playing hard rock sounds or classic rock sounds, I'll go to their Marshall because they have that sim available, and that has a really good tone in my opinion. In fact, I think I got a video on some rock tones, hard rock tones, using that plugin you can watch up here. So with plugins, I would recommend just using that style of amp and mimicking the settings that I've given you here on this amp. And of course, we're about to go through the other settings here. Okay, so back to the settings here. Let's take a look at the bass. Now, the bass on these types of amps, or this type of channel rather, I like to have the bass kind of up the middle, maybe even cut just a hair, because if you're not using an OD pedal or anything to clean up, which again, I'm not using any overdrive pedal, I'm not using really anything at all in front of the amp. I didn't even use a noise gate in front of this channel here. But my bass is cut back a little bit because with this amp, this channel, with this type of amp, you have a tendency to kind of have that bass almost can sound overdriven, if that makes sense, if you've got that cut up too much. And the other part with recording guitars in general is you want your bass guitar to handle the low end frequencies. You don't want your guitars to be handling that, because if you've got the bass cranked up too much, then those frequencies will compete with one another and you're more apt to get a muddy sound. Now, let's talk about the mids. This is one of my favorite parts of EQ here. I normally like my mids cut. I usually play with my mids cut between 3 and 4. You know, I have been obsessed with that Master of Puppets and Justice for All guitar tone since I've been playing guitar, since like 1989, long time ago. In this case, for the classic heavy metal tone that I'm going for, I actually wanted the mids boosted. And to me, when you're playing this style of amp that's going to give you that classic heavy metal tone, or in this case, the channel that's going to give you that style, the mids being boosted, which I've got between 6 and 7 here, the mids being boosted is going to help bring out a little bit more character, maybe a little bit more clarity as well, in my opinion. So for this tone, I've got the mids on this channel boosted again to about 6, 7. Now my treble here is about the same. It's right between 6 and 7, about 6.5. And I'll be honest with you guys, my treble, man, it rarely changes with any style of music that I'm playing. That's kind of where my treble sits for most every amp, for most every style. And that's just, I don't know, that's just one of those personal preferences. Sometimes you just find a style on your EQ with a specific part of the EQ that just fits, right? That just fits your style of playing across the board. And for treble, that's just been one of those things. This setting works for me. You can play around with that. Some people like to boost their highs more. Some people like to cut the highs back. Now, a lot of that could also depend on the style of guitar you're playing, which we'll go over that in a second too. Now, my volume on this amp, I'm recording in a very small, I did record this live. This is a live amp. I recorded in a small 10x11 studio here. Okay, so my volume is actually pretty low, but this amp, you can still capture a pretty decent tone. Not the best tone, but a decent tone at a lower volume with the Shure SM57 mic. And of course, you've got to have your input on your interface up enough so it's capturing that tone. You never want to have that interface volume too high. I think mine's around 38, so we've got plenty of headroom there. Now we head over to the presence. Presence is something that's really, to me, determined by the type of amp, or in this case, type of channel that you're playing through. Most of the time on this particular amp, I've got my presence cut to about 4. Now that's when I'm playing with the red channel, the fire-breathing gain channel. However, for this tone and for this channel, for the sound I'm going for here, I actually boosted my presence a little bit, just a little bit past 6. Now again, this is my personal preference. To me, this sounded good. The presence being boosted a little bit on this type of amp or this type of channel, capturing the type of tone that we're going after, that classic heavy metal tone. This seems to kind of work like the mids being boosted a little. It just seems to bring out a little bit more character. Now, a lot of times on this specific amp, when I have it on the fire-breathing gain channel, I've actually got my presence cut a little bit. So I was kind of surprised when I was messing around with the settings. I'm like, this is not sounding quite like I want it to with the presence cut. So I just, of course, I tweaked my settings a little bit and tried boosting it to this level, and that seemed to work. One thing I'll say about presence, and this is, again, just a personal preference here, doesn't mean it's wrong or right, but my presence is never extreme. None of my settings are ever really extreme. If I'm cutting stuff, it's usually going to be at about 4, with the exception of mids. If I'm playing some other styles of metal where I want that mid cut a little bit more, I'll go to 3.5. When I'm boosting anything, I rarely ever move that past 7. To me, that gives you more of that true character of the amp. And again, it doesn't mean it's right or wrong. Some people like extreme settings and that works for them. That's just never worked for me. So that's just kind of my philosophy, is just to kind of keep things simple and just make these tiny adjustments along the way. All right, now moving on to effects. As you can see, here's my pedal board. I didn't use anything in front of the amp, not even a noise gate, no booster, nothing. I did have a little bit of delay on. And looking back, I probably should have recorded this with no delay. I mean, usually when you're playing rhythms, you don't want any delay on it. But I was kind of just hearing this kind of 80s classic metal sound. I know I say classic metal and we can kind of go back to the 70s. Probably they didn't use delay on their rhythm tones. Maybe sometimes they did, I don't know. But I don't know, I'm a big fan of the 80s, so whenever I hear a tone that's of that era or maybe a little bit earlier than that, for some reason, just adding just a pinch of delay just makes it sound cooler. So that might be the part in this video that makes my classic heavy metal tone not so classic and more of a 80s heavy metal tone, but hey, I use it anyway, and at the end of the day, we're all just trying to dial in tones that we like to hear. Oh crap, I told you I'd talk about the guitar. So real quick, before we end this, let me just share this. I know a lot of you know what this is because you've seen this in my videos for the past, like, I don't know, 10 years or so now. This is the LTD M-1000 Deluxe, all right? And it's got the active EMG pickups. I say that to say this is totally not a classic heavy metal guitar. I should be holding something like, I guess, I don't know, a Gibson SG or maybe a Fender Strat or Les Paul or something like that. I'm a big fan of just using what you have. If you want a particular tone, if you've got enough gear or the gear to come close to that, hey, sometimes good enough has to be equivalent to perfection. Otherwise, you'll never get that thing out there, and that's a whole different conversation for another time. But ideally, I would have played something probably with passive pickups, and maybe if I had access to like a more vintage guitar, I would have played that for you guys here. But don't get so caught up in the details that you don't move forward with, your song or your album, or if you're just practicing to get to a certain level, don't get so hung up on those details that it prevents you from moving forward to where you need to be. Of course, unless you're just somebody who likes to play around with tones and different gear, and that's fine if that's the case. But if you're going for something else, like again, like trying to release something or something like that, don't allow yourself to get hung up on the details to the point to where it just makes you stagnant and just kind of holds you there. Okay, so hopefully that made sense. But yeah, guys, this is my classic heavy metal guitar tone. I hope you guys enjoyed this. Again, you know, I'm playing through a specific amp and specific channel. So just use what I'm giving you, and I've got that in the description of this video. Use those settings and just kind of tweak them to your liking and see what you can come up with. Hey, throw something out there on Instagram and then tag me. I'll like it and respond to you if you guys want to do that. Hey Jason, here's my classic heavy metal tone based on your video. So yeah. Also, when you're in the description, again, I've got the settings in there. If you don't have my free metal guitar practice guide, Metal Riffs and Licks, be sure to grab a copy of that. That's going to be that first hyperlink, the first link in the YouTube description down there. So grab a copy of that. If you already have that, of course, the next step would be getting into my Metal Riff Master course. So do check those out. Guys, thank you so much for supporting my channel. We just hit the 30K mark a couple days ago. I think the last video I put out a couple days before this video was my 30K YouTube Shorts video. So I really appreciate your support for supporting me here. If you haven't subscribed, go ahead and do that now and make sure you turn notifications on. I am constantly putting out content for you guys. I love doing this. I love you guys being a part of my guitar community. It's awesome. Until the next video, you know what to do. Keep it metal, or keep it classic heavy metal for today.